liar, and the bride is a shill. The priest says, if these two don't make it, who among us ever will? Don't ask the love you dare for a prediction wherein the lovers of tomorrow are involved. I guess time just makes fools of us all. Oh,
hey guys, it's Joel with the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast, and this is the second part of the Mirror World episode. So I want to talk about Gnosticism, if anyone's familiar with it. It's, in the 2nd century, there's this sect of Christianity that sort of emerges, and the followers of it believe that the world we inhabited was not created by the real God. There was a real God, and they were Christians, but that the world that we were inhabiting sort of had a fake God chaperoning it, and that the message of Jesus and the mission of Christians was to break through into the real world to meet the real God. And it was made, the bad world was made by this creature called the Demiurge, and it was responsible for all of material reality. But the Demiurge had dementia, had kind of forgotten who it was. And so, it was this creature that was a creation of, the true God, but because of a kind of cosmic mix-up, it lost its identity, and it ended up on the middle of where we are. And so it created the world and decided, well, I must have created everything because I don't remember anything else, and now I'm here. And so, its blindness was sort of metaphorically similar to our blindness in that it became this tyrant of the Old Testament, And this is all later, made heretical and taken out of Christianity. There's not Christians that know this theology today. I'm not advocating for the theology. I'm using it as a metaphor here. But it wasn't a fringe movement. It was a major current of early religious thought. And at some point, there were a lot of people, maybe the majority of the faith, that had elements of these schools of thought in how they thought. And so, the Gnostics were trying to solve this problem that people today are still trying to solve, or theologians are still trying to solve, where they say, if God's good and all-powerful, why is the world so full of suffering? Why do kids get sick? Why do the innocent suffer, while wicked prosper? Why is there evil? And so the orthodox answer is that there's, free will and fallen nature and a mysterious divine plan that never, quite is satisfying for some people. That's what you get after the Council of Nicaea, when Christianity is kind of codified. But before that, the Gnostics are offering, way before that, the Gnostics are offering this, more radical idea that the world is full of suffering because the world was made by a being who didn't know what he was doing. And it's why in the Old Testament sometimes God, or the false God, behaves badly, as the Gnostics would tell you. He's wrathful or vindictive, or has qualities they wouldn't associate with goodness. And so the Demiurge, who's the false God with dementia that thinks he created the earth, but he actually didn't. He's not really evil. He's just confused because he was this fragment of divine light that had fallen from its source, and it no longer remembered its origin. And so in this confusion, he created the material world as if it were the only reality, and he declared, I'm God, and there is no other. And this is why Gnostics identified the Demiurge with the God of the Old Testament, that he was jealous and wrathful, and he demanded obedience and punished followers. Or not followers who went astray, foods and plague, floods, plagues, and sometimes food. And so it seemed very different than the loving Father that Jesus, describes. And so the Gnostics say that's not the true God, that's the confused creator who thinks that he's the only one. And, this also lets you deal with all these ideas that Plato had, let loose. Plato's already talking about the real world being fake, and that if you're in Plato's cave, you see only shadow figures of the real thing. And so it sort of lets everyone put the zeitgeist and cultural currents and thought, leading cutting-edge thought of the Bronze Age together into this way that makes it all work together a little bit better. And so the Gnostics, take the Platonism and they make it religious. The material world isn't just inferior to the spiritual world. It's actually a trap. This is a prison. The body isn't the temple of the soul. It's the soul's cage. You're on a planet that is a prison. If you recognize the phrase prison planet, if you're about my age, then you probably are starting to see where I'm going with this, because that's something that the radio conspiracy, right-wing guy, Alex Jones, says. Because these ideas don't really go away, the Gnostic ideas. That's why I'm bringing them up. Human beings, according to Gnosticism, they contain within them these sparks of the origin light, of God. And, we could feel, even if we couldn't articulate it, that the Demiurge's world was not complete, that something real lay beyond it, and something had been lost. We had this sort of divine inheritance that was not here. And some of the language in the Bible sort of supported that, or was used to cite these ideas at that time. And so, the multiple writings that hadn't really been codified into the Bible yet. But, this inward turn, this sense that the truth lies within, rather than in an external authority, it was kind of dangerous, to certain orders. It was a neat gift, that Gnostics gave people to think about, these things in a way that was more personal and not like asking for someone to save me, but going inside so that I can connect with salvation myself. But the danger was that it could lead to rejection of the body, you not taking care of yourself, asceticism, of community, and also some of the material conditions of life. The gift is that it says that each person has direct access to the divine, and that no institution could monopolize the path to truth, and that the inner life mattered as much as the outer, and that, it was the job of Christians to build communities that pointed people inward, that's what the church should be. That's an idea that would become very threatening, to the modern medieval church, or modern from this time, not our time. The word Gnosticism comes from gnosis, which just means knowledge, not facts or information, but direct experience of what is real. And the Gnostics believed that we were trapped in a false reality, and that salvation meant waking up to what the Demiurge's world had hidden from us, going back home to where we came from. And the early church rebranded, that as heresy. It said most of the Gnostic texts are destroyed. If you have anything heretical, you're in trouble. So for centuries, Gnosticism survived, kind of as a rumor or a memory, oral teaching. Or it survived in ideas of people that didn't really understand the inheritance that they were carrying on. And then in 1945, there's this jar discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And inside were Gnostic gospels and treatises. And they were hidden for 2,000 years. The heresy had preserved itself because somebody had hidden it away, probably during one of the purges. And I wanted to use Gnosticism as a frame for what I'm about to describe, the second part of the Mirror World episode. Maybe you're starting to make that connection already, because I think it's not literally true. I'm not a Gnostic. There were some semi-modern Gnostics, like the writer Philip K. Dick. People end up there. Creative people and nefarious other people like Alex Jones who kind of co-opt this language. But the structure of this maps onto our contemporary situation with kind of an uncomfortable precision, because we built institutions that were supposed to reflect truth, reality, the real thing. Science, education, economics, psychology, journalism, expertise, itself. The hierarchies of this person's at this point above you because they know more about something. Specialization. And then these were our instruments for perceiving what's true. And they were supposed to be windows into a real world that democratized expertise for people who didn't have it through appointing experts and systems that acted as experts. But these windows became mirrored at a certain point. The institutions were meant to represent reality, but they became disconnected from it, and now we mistake the representation for the thing itself. The Demiurge isn't the algorithm, and the Demiurge is the whole system of professional legitimacy that forgot it was supposed to point back to reality, not to numbers that no longer reflected reality accurately. But when all you can see is the numbers, all you can see is that demiurgic world, and the only way you believe that you have to change yourself or that you have to change the world are through these fake systems that no longer connect to the real, how do you change anything? Experts would study the world before carefully and then report what they found. Scientists, when when they tested hypotheses, they would publish results, and economists would model the economy to help us understand it. Psychologists would develop frameworks for thinking about the mind. And educators would assess students to see what they'd learned. Journalists would investigate and tell us what was true. And the credentials, the peer review, the standardized measures, these were supposed to be quality controls, ways to ensure that what the institution said reflected what was actually happening. And the representation was meant to serve the reality. And for a while, something like this worked, not perfectly. Institutions have always been flawed and always had blind spots and biases, but the connection between representation and reality was still visible, and that it was the goal of the organization, not the other way around. Not to change the world by changing the representation, which is what we're trying to do now. Remember in the early 90s, I was a kid, but I was talking to somebody about why do people think that these very clear models of economic direction that we're going in work? Because we see the more we adopt them, they get worse. I was talking about politics, and the person said I was at a dinner party with all these people, and they believe something different about economics than me. And they were talking about how, all the people in their life are so bad with money, and their hairdresser and their wife and their kids, and nobody understands it. And then they would espouse these models that under the economy, everyone acts logically, rationally, in the self-interested way to drive this beautiful engine forward. And the guy said, I said to the party of people, hey, you just said no one does that. And then you said that the only way forward for the economy is to do it by this model, assuming that they do. Why? And everybody just kind of looked at their wine glass for a minute, and they couldn't justify what they believed. And then they went back to talking. It's always stuck with me. When this map has diverged too far from the territory, people can't see. The problem with comparing and contrasting things is that you need both of the things visible. When one of the things gets too far away from the other thing, then that's all you can see. So you can't really compare and contrast anymore, and that's what happened. As these systems moved further and further away from what they were supposed to do, we stopped listening to any of the cognitive dissonance, any of the emotional overwhelm, any of the gut feeling that these things weren't real anymore. And we just decided that it was all that we could see, and so that it's all that it was. It's kind of like the joke about the drunk under the lamp. I heard a talk where Noam Chomsky told that joke, and he said, that there's a guy who's drunk and he's looking under the streetlight for his keys. And the guy says, why are you looking on this side of the road? Because it's, got this street light here. Did you drop your keys there? The guy said, no, I dropped them on the other side of the road. And the guy said, well, why don't you look on the other side of the road for your keys? And he said, because the other side of the road's dark. This is where the light is. I can't see anything over there. I talked about Theodore Porter quite a bit, but, one of the points that is continually relevant that he makes is that the disciplines that quantify most heavily aren't the confident disciplines. They're the vulnerable ones. Economics, psychology, sociology, education. They're fields that are under attack, fields that lack the prestige of physics or chemistry, fields where practitioners feel that they have to prove that the science that they're doing is real. Well, if they want to do it, they should know that already. Porter showed how this works historically. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they didn't develop cost-benefit analysis because it was the best way to evaluate flood control. In fact, sometimes it makes that project harder. They developed it because Congress didn't trust them with money. The numbers were a shield against political attack. Every decision could be defended by pointing to a calculation. The more insecure the field, the more it retreats behind numbers. Not because numbers work better, often they work worse, but because numbers provide legitimacy, the appearance of objectivity, defense against critics. And as a writer, I can tell you that when you are creating things for your critics, it's not going to be very good. Here's the trap. The more that an institution depends on the metric and systems of metrics for legitimacy, the more it has to protect that metric from scrutiny. You can't admit that the measure is flawed because the measure is all you have. We talked in the DSM series about the 3 meetings after the DSM-3 was written, where they basically agreed that the system didn't work, but that they couldn't change it because too much was tied to that system. And you can't question the test because the test is what makes you an expert. Porter traced this to a strange discovery in the 19th century, astronomy. The personal equation. Different observers measuring the same stellar transit got different results. And the same reality produced different numbers depending on who was watching. And the response was telling. Instead of accepting that trained judgment varies, that expertise involves personal skill, maybe that science is half art and half science, or at least some measure, they built machines. And they replaced human observation with automated recording. And they eliminated the observer. And this is the birth of mechanical objectivity, the dream of knowledge untouched by human judgment, numbers that measure themselves, truth without perspective. But Porter discovered something crucial. The disciplines that rely the most heavily on mechanical objectivity aren't the strongest. Elite physicians at CERN don't use rigid protocols. They trust trained judgment. They have what Porter calls disciplinary objectivity, the confidence that comes from secure professional community. The weak disciplines retreat into mechanical objectivity precisely because they're weak. They build elaborate quantitative systems not because numbers work better, but because numbers defend against attack, and checklists are a form of number. Adam Curtis, with what we mentioned to New York in the last episode, he documented something different. The profit motive and the assumptions baked into the infrastructure of governance itself, even representative governance. What Curtis showed across his films is how the economic order that emerged in the 1970s, neoliberalism, didn't just impose policies. It imposed a model. And when the bankers took over New York in 1975, they didn't just demand austerity, they demanded that the city be governed according to their spreadsheets. The model contained assumptions that a city exists to service bond obligations, that human welfare is a cost to be minimized, that the market's judgment is the only judgment that matters. And those assumptions weren't debated. They were built into the calculations. They became the operating system. Curtis traced how this spread. The Nixon shock in 1971 took the dollar off gold, turning currencies into free-floating abstractions that banks could trade. The politicians, faced with systems too complex to control, stopped trying to shape reality and started becoming managers of the representation of reality. They started dealing with aesthetics, how reality looked, instead of reality itself, especially material reality. How much do you have to eat? How much is a dollar worth? How is the quality of the education that your kids get? And if you have cancer, can you go to the doctor? And more crucially to this podcast, what is psychotherapy and what is its job? What is the nature of self and what is the nature of healthy? They became, as political scientist Peter Mayer put it, managers of processes that they could no longer direct, representing power to the people, rather than representing the people to power. And once the assumptions are infrastructure, the profit motive takes over. You don't need a conspiracy, you just need incentives. You don't even need propaganda anymore. The testing companies profit from testing, so testing expands. The financing sector profits from complexity, so complexity increases. The tech platforms profit from engagement, so engagement gets optimized at the expense of everything else, like news or reality. Curtis calls this the retreat into a fake world. Politicians moved the red ribbon on the map and they called it victory. They optimized the metrics and they ignored the territory. This creates what Curtis documents as a bifurcated world. The measurements and the models of professional legitimacy, and then the actual world, which goes increasingly unattended by any adults. The fake world is where careers happen, where credentials matter, where the metrics determine success. The real world is where the factories close, where the climate destabilizes, where the people who feel the gap between their experience and the official story live. The profit motive ensures that the fake world keeps expanding. There's money in metrics, there's money in credentials, there's money in the apparatus of professional legitimacy. There's no money in territory. The territory is a cost center. And the assumptions ensure that we can't see what's happening. If the model assumes rational actors, then irrational behavior must be an anomaly to be corrected, not a signal to be heard. And if the model assumes that markets are efficient, then market failures are temporary glitches, not structural features. If the model assumes the metrics capture what matters, then what the metrics miss doesn't exist. And this is how you get cut off from the real, not by lying, but by building systems that literally cannot perceive what it is not designed to measure. and then making that system the only source of legitimacy. And the incentives point everyone towards the mirror. The assumptions make the territory invisible, and the generation after that generation grows up inside a faker and faker world, never knowing that there was supposed to be something on the other side. And here's what I want you to see. These systems pretend to understand you. They pretend to help us change. They pretend to give us tools for evaluating the world. But they don't actually do any of those things. They do imitations of those things, and the imitations cut us off further from what actually is real.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders was supposed to help clinicians understand patients. It was supposed to be a tool, a shared vocabulary for describing the variation of human suffering so that practitioners could communicate and research could accumulate. But the DSM became something else, like we discussed in that series. It became the definition of what mental illness is. If your suffering fits a code, it's real. If it doesn't, it's not. That would be a problem, but then something further happened. And I want to be clear because a lot of people get angry that I won't critique the DSM on those grounds. I'm not saying that that a manual could encompass all of these things in a way that honors your humanity. That argument's already been made. I'm making a different one. Not that that isn't a problem. There's a problem that is bigger. You have 3 times where people sat down and they realized that the DSM still wasn't reliable. You had multiple psychiatrists, you had multiple therapists, all seeing patients with the same presentation, but calling it different things. So all of the changes to make that manual more reliable. How do you make sure that what they're talking about, when somebody comes in with this presentation, they end up with the same label put on them, made the labels further and further from what was valid or real. This is why the NIMH dumped the DSM and said this thing isn't pointing to anything that is biological, reproducible, or real. Stop using it. And I don't agree with all of their reasons for doing that. But it is what the institute that is supposed to control our mental health science said after many years of clinical therapists saying the same thing. The DSM pretends to help you change. Here's your diagnosis, here's the treatment protocol, here's the expected outcome, and all in the name of science. But the change it offers is an adjustment to the system that made you sick. They don't go back to the drawing board and realize that anxiety and depression usually appear at the same time. Maybe these are related diagnoses. They don't go back to what the symptoms are actually saying. They just go back to the same labels that we've always called these things, and then move them around slightly. Because the label, the system, the reflection of reality is now more real than what the experience of the patient or the reproducible experiences of multiple human brains are telling the researchers. But we can't change it. In education, the tests were supposed to measure learning. They were supposed to help us understand what students knew so that we could teach them better. But the test became the definition of learning. What's on the test is what gets taught. What's not on the test doesn't exist. Teaching to the test isn't a corruption of education. It's what education has become. And if you taught something that wasn't on the test, you didn't teach anything. It wasn't real. The tests prepare you to understand students. Here's a score that captures your ability, your potential, your place in a hierarchy around certain metrics. The system knows what you're capable of. But the score doesn't know you. It doesn't know why you froze during the exam, or what you understand deeply but can't express in multiple choice, or what gifts you have that no one tests to measure, or what strengths that you have that have been unrecognized because the system hasn't found the seed or the divine spark of those things, and you learned to help you know how to use them. The test pretends to offer mobility. Score high and doors open, the meritocracy will reward your ability, but the tests measure familiarity with testing. And familiarity with testing correlates with class background, with resources, with ability to buy preparation. The ACT doesn't really measure how prepared a student is for college. It doesn't measure how much they know. It doesn't measure anything that they learned from high school. It measures how much time, resources, and maybe forceful parents forced them to study for that test. And so we've started to accept these new things that don't point back to anything in reality as the gatekeeping for reality itself, even though they're not connected. And mainstream science and research tells us they're not connected anymore. And this is crucial. The systems don't just fail to help. They actively prevent help while performing helpfulness. And they've convinced us that they are the only things that can help us. And the only ways that the system can change is more of the system itself. If you believe anything else, you're just not being reasonable. Means testing was supposed to ensure that resources got to those who need them. It was supposed to be responsible stewardship. But means testing has become a system for denying resources while maintaining the appearance of resources being available to those who deserve them. Fill out this form, provide this documentation, wait for this determination. The process pretends to evaluate your need, but the process is designed to create friction, to exhaust applicants, to make people give up before they receive what they're technically entitled to have. The bureaucracy pretends to serve you. Here are the procedures. Follow them and you'll get help. But the procedures multiply. The requirements become impossible. The system that's supposed to assist you becomes an obstacle course designed to wear you down so that you leave. And if you leave, then the system can pretend that it helped everybody who needed help. If you've ever been in an insurance referral trap, going back and forth between getting referred to different doctors and then needing a referral to get what you need, so you have to go to a doctor that you don't need that thing just to get the referral to the next one, you're familiar with what this feels like. And that's why I'm talking about the effect that the world has on us now, the modern world, on a psychotherapy podcast, why I think all these disciplines are related to what people are bringing into my office. Because it culminates in the same feeling. If you fail, if you can't navigate the forms, if you miss a deadline, if you don't have the documentation, that's your failure. The system offered you help, you just didn't take it properly, along with everyone else in the world who could not get through these goalposts that weren't designed to help you. They were designed to prove that the system is helpful. And here's what these systems have in common. They perform the gestures of understanding, of helping, of change, without delivering the substance. They don't care. And we feel that. The economic model performs analysis. It crunches numbers, it generates projections, it produces authoritative-looking outputs, but it's analyzing its own assumptions, not reality. That's why I think LLMs that are also doing this are a perfect metaphor for our cultural moment. The DSM performs diagnosis. It sorts symptoms into categories. It applies labels. It generates treatment plans, but it's organizing its own classification system, not grasping the symptoms as they exist in the people who come into the room. It's trying to make the people fit the diagnosis, not the diagnosis fit the person. And the test performs evaluation. It marks ranks and it sorts, but it's measuring familiarity with testing, not with learning, which was what it was designed to do. That's what's real, not studying for the test. Education, that's the reality. The bureaucracy performs assistance. It processes applications, it makes determinations, it distributes resources, but it's managing its own procedures. It's not meeting human need because it doesn't care, and anyone who interacts with the bureaucracy feels that. And each system creates an elaborate imitation of what it claims to do. The imitation is convincing enough that we keep turning to these systems for help. But the help doesn't come because the understanding isn't there. The change doesn't happen. And that's the trap. When the system fails, we blame ourselves. The economy isn't working for me. I must not be competitive enough. The therapy isn't helping. I must be resistant to treatment. The test says I'm not smart. I must actually not be smart. The bureaucracy rejected my application. I must have made a mistake, or I must be worthless. We don't blame the systems because the systems are the only legitimate authority, and they're the only things certified to tell us what's real now. If the verdict doesn't match our experience must be wrong. A lot of times people come to my office and they say, I know these things aren't real. I know they're not real and that I shouldn't feel this way because of them. But if I admit to them myself that they're not real, then the world is so crazy I don't know how to live in it. And I think that lots of people feel that all the time. And now we have these large language models, and they reveal what was always happening anyway. The LLMs are doing exactly what these systems have always done. They're just doing it more transparently, and they're more completely and more undeniably. The LLM pretends to understand you. We say that we understand that about them before we start talking to them, and we start feeling them, and we start becoming dependent on their input. It's just processing your input. It generates a response, it mimics comprehension, it sounds like understanding, it performs the gestures of a mind engaging with another mind, but it doesn't understand you. It's predicting statistically, like continuations, based on patterns in its training data. It has no model of you, no sense of your history, no grasp of what your words actually mean. It's doing an extremely sophisticated imitation of understanding. And the LLM pretends to help you change. It offers advice, generates plans, provides information, and it performs the role of a helpful assistant dedicated to your improvement. But it can't help you change. It doesn't know what change would mean for you. It doesn't understand your situation. It can't tell you the emotions that you're avoiding because it's not pushy, it's not challenging. It's not listening to what you need, it's listening to what you want. And what you want isn't what you need, or else you wouldn't be in the situation that you are in trying to get therapy from an LLM. It's generating outputs that look like help based on what help has looked like in its training data. And the LLM pretends to evaluate the world for you. It answers questions, it summarizes information, it offers assessments, it performs expertise, but it's not actually authoritative. But it's not evaluating anything. It's reflecting back what's already been written. And it's the ghost of the archive, speaking in authoritative tones about things that it has no capacity to actually assess. And the means testing, the bureaucracy, the economic models, the diagnostic codes, the standardized test, they're all proto-LLMs. They were getting you ready for this system, where the thing that was supposed to be helping you was so unhelpful, and you were so dissociated from noticing that when the person who was forced by the system to perform this role in this way that wasn't helpful as a representative of bureaucracy, not a representative of reality, was taken away and replaced with a computer, you wouldn't notice because they were so much the same. And hey, the computer has more time for me. The computer has more energy. The computer doesn't have these problematic emotions. And that other person wasn't really helping me anyway because I forgot what was ever possible in therapy or in customer service or in an encounter with another person. I don't remember, so I don't feel robbed. The LLM is just the final revelation. It's the ultimate expression. The thing itself stripped of pretense. When you interact with a large language model, you are seeing the institutions for what they've always been. Pattern matching systems that simulate comprehension, that generate plausible looking outputs, and that perform helpfulness without helping. And just like the institutions, when the LLMs fail us, when its advice doesn't work, when its understanding proves hollow, we're likely to blame ourselves. And I'll add, more likely, when these companies stop giving it to you for free, we'll blame ourselves. And here's the cruelest part. As we feel worse and worse, as the system fails us more and more obviously, as the gap between the mirror and the territory become harder to ignore, we dig into these systems as solutions. The economy isn't working, so we demand better economic policy, which means we demand better manipulation of the model that's disconnected from reality, and more fudging the metrics that are supposed to measure it. Instead of saying, you feel like the world is a good place, I feel like it's worse. Our mental health is deteriorating, so we expand access to treatment, which means we sort people more into diagnostic categories that don't capture their actual suffering. Students aren't learning, so we intensify educational reform, which means we developed more neoliberal, sophisticated testing regimes that measure test-taking ability. We privatize education more and add more and more economic middlemen in between paying teachers to teach students. Yeah, we need more information technology platforms because all the smart people are living education. They just are tired of dealing with the BS, and they were willing to do it for little money to help students, but they're leaving because of all this bureaucracy. We need more education technology platforms. Oh, the educational technology platforms don't really work. Maybe they should be LLMs. We'll do everything except go back and challenge the initial assumption that started to make the system worse. And we've been convinced that these systems are the only things that work. That expertise means navigating the model, not looking outside of it. And the intelligence means passing the test. That health means fitting the diagnostic criteria. That economic success means performing well according to these metrics. So when the system fails us, we don't abandon it. We try harder at the same system. And we get more credentials. We see more specialists. We fill out more forms. And we optimize our prompts for the LLM better. The system has convinced us that they're the only path. And the worse that they work, the more desperately we cling to them because we've forgotten that there was ever anything else to cling to. And we can't look inward, just like someone in the Gnostic hell. Here's what makes this almost impossible to fix. Each generation gets further and further from remembering what institutions were supposed to do. I once heard, the recordings in the 1980s. And it's like on these Jungian lectures that I listened to when I was getting into Jung. They're like poor quality tapes on 1980s Sony tape recorders. And these teachers were retiring in the 80s that had done this for their whole career, and they were going to these Jungian lectures because they were into Carl Jung. And they were saying that they were watching students who could pass tests that were now being required because this was the birth of standardized testing, was the Reagan accountability, Reagan-Thatcher, revolution. But the students who were passing the tests they'd mastered this metric, but they'd missed the substance. The teachers are saying in these talks, the students that are now getting good grades are stupid. They don't know anything and they didn't learn anything. Sometimes I don't think they can. One teacher said, they don't understand anything about education. They don't understand anything about themselves. They just know how to pass the test. And these students are now the experts. They're the ones who designed the tests to run the schools, to set the policies, the tests they succeeded at in 1980. They're the success cases. Proof that the system works. They climbed the ladder, but the system provided. Why would they question the ladder? And their students are even further removed. They've never known an educational system that wasn't organized around standardized measurement. The test isn't a representation of learning to them. It's what learning means. You can't point them to the territory because they've never seen it. The map is all that they know. And this is happening across all the institutions, which is why I'm talking about so many, to try and build a map for you of the world and explain how much this is invading your and my assumptions about everything, implicit assumptions that we don't think about. In economics, we now have multiple generations of practitioners trained entirely within frameworks that assume rational actors, efficient markets, equilibrium models, the assumptions that aren't examined, that, by the way, never work if you've looked at the news for the past 30 years. Because the assumptions can't be examined. They're the water that everyone swims in. Like my patients are pointing out, starting to question these systems at all looks indistinguishable in this world from madness. And here's the bind that we live in. These institutions are broken. They no longer reliably reflect reality. The metrics have become divorced from what they were supposed to measure, and the expertise has become self-referential, no longer connected to what it was supposed to reference. The whole apparatus of professional legitimacy has turned into a hall of mirrors. Everyone still treats these institutions as the only things that grant legitimacy. You can shout about the territory all you want, but this is this metamodern trap. We know the map is wrong. We feel the gap between the representation and the territory, but the only paths to change run through the map, and the only legitimacy comes from the institution. And so the only reality recognized is the one that the mirror shows. In philosophy, a growing body of philosophers are calling this the metamodern. It's an oscillation, the way that we swing between two positions without being able to rest in either. Knowing that the world isn't real, but being functionally paralyzed if we act like it isn't. The grand narrative, is seductive because complexity is overwhelming and there's too much information, too many variables, too many perspectives. Deconstruction is hard, so the clean story cuts through the chaos. It gives you something to hold on to. But a lot of times it's a reduction, it's an oversimplification, it's your own emotional bias, or it's a conspiracy theory instead of looking at reality. And the grand narrative is always a lie, but it leaves things out. It oversimplifies. It creates victims whose suffering don't fit the story. Eventually the cracks show. The exceptions multiply and the model fails. On the other side, we have infinite complexity. Everything is connected. Nothing is simple. Every framework is incomplete. Every narrative is construction, and every metric is an approximation. The ground dissolves under your feet. Infinite complexity is more accurate, but it's also paralyzing. If everything is connected and nothing is simple, how do you act? Where do you start? The complexity overwhelms the capacity for decision-making. You drown in qualifying everything. The metamodern condition is oscillating between these two poles. You reach for the grand narrative and then you see through it. You fall into complexity and then you grab for something solid. But it doesn't feel like a meaningful world. Back and forth. Neither position is stable. Neither lets you see clearly. In psychology, this is, the powerful hero myths of us against them. Or the infinite moral relativism of everybody just doing what they feel like is right and nothing really meaning anything, morality being dead. We sort of know that we have to engage with both, but we don't know how because they're so paradoxical. The institutions offer grand narratives. That's their product. Clean categories, clear metrics, authoritative pronouncements. And this is what expertise means. This is what the test measures. This is what the diagnosis is. The territory, the actual world, offers complexity, things that don't fit categories. experiences that exceed frameworks and realities that metrics can't capture. We oscillate between them because we can't rest in either. The narrative is a lie, but the complexity is unbearable, so we swing, and in the swinging we never land on solid ground. This is the metamodern condition. There's a common dismissal that circulates in certain spaces. Facts don't care about your feelings is something that people will say. There's this idea that if you're acting logical, then you're acting well. And the implication is that emotional responses are noise, irrational reactions that cloud the pure signal of logic and data. But the problem with that is that it is insane. When I make a point about what's wrong with these systems, when I articulate the trap that we're in, the way that institutions have failed us, the disconnection from reality, I'm making an emotional point. I'm speaking from my emotional system, from its needs, from the way the world works, from where my needs aren't being met, and that hurts, from where I see it not meeting others, and that hurts me more, from the intuition that arises when there is something deeply wrong. The difference isn't that I'm being logical and unemotional, while the people I'm critiquing are being emotional. The difference is that I'm not clouding my emotional perception with unprocessed trauma. A lot of people who want to avoid bias, trauma responses, and myopicness say that we should have less emotion. The problem is that when you do that, you're just hiding where the emotion is from yourself. The emotional system is an instrument of perceiving reality. It tells you something. Something is wrong. When something is dangerous, when something matters. Most importantly, it tells you something that your objectivity cannot see. Intuition isn't irrational. It's a pattern recognition. It's operating faster than conscious thought. And the felt sense of wrongness when the model doesn't match the territory, that is data. It's just not qualified. It's just not quantified data. But it is information, and that's the organism telling you something important. When people dismiss emotional knowing, they usually point to someone who's dysregulated, someone who's screaming, someone who's lost control, somebody who hurt them, the abuser who wouldn't manage their own trauma. They don't want to be like that. Or they will point to somebody embarrassing, who's clearly not aware of how they perceive. See, they say that's what happens when you trust your feelings. That's where emotions lead. But that's not emotions. That's trauma hijacking the emotional system. That's someone who's outside of the window of tolerance, of what they're allowed and able to feel. That's past pain preventing current perception. And that's exactly what happens when you don't trust feelings, when you suppress and deny them until they explode in dysregulated ways. And what they are really saying, the people who make this argument, especially about psychology, needing to be more objective, more metric focused, and less focused on the person, they're saying that these emotional spaces are not trustworthy. And when you don't trust them in others, it's because you don't trust them in yourself. So just be very afraid of those people. They're saying don't feel your emotional system. Go insane pretending that you're a purely logical creature who can just white knuckle it through life with behaviorism. Retreat to the metrics, the models, the quantified representations that mechanical objectivity provides. It'll never make you feel good, but it might stop you from knowing that you feel bad. And if anything, it gets rid of all this messy uncertainty that you have to sit with in real life. It just sort of tells you what to do. Isn't that nice? But mechanical objectivity is itself a product of emotional distress. Porter showed us that. It's what frightened disciplines do when they don't trust themselves. It is the retreat behind numbers that happens when you've been attacked enough that judgment feels dangerous. The people who navigate best, the master clinicians, the wise elders, the ones who actually help, the good therapists, they're not suppressing their emotional system. They're not pretending to be logical machines. They're feeling everything and thinking clearly at the same time, and their emotional perception isn't clouded by trauma. So it works as an instrument of knowing. And yes, no one's a master at that. I'm certainly not. We're always trying to hit a moving target. But we've forgotten
that was the goal, the real. And whenever I record something on the metamodern or about how our system of science, especially around psychology, is no longer pointing us back to things that we need desperately, a lot of people think that I'm advocating for one political solution or one systematic or bureaucratic solution or the other. And I'm largely not doing any of those things that y'all think, because all of those things are part of a system that, again, I don't think can be hooked up to changing the system, which is what I'm critiquing. So what do we do? How do we move forward? The people that say, what's the solution? Well, here's my best shot.
Remember James Hillman, a psychologist we talked about a long time ago, sort of a post-Jungian analyst, or David Tacey would say he called pre-Jungian ideas post-Jungian, but whatever. Interesting psychologist. And near the end of his life, he published a book of conversations about Carl Jung's The Red Book. And that massive illuminated manuscript is interesting. It's the one in my office if you're a patient of mine, or if you've seen a photo of my office. But it was Jung's own personal diary or record of his encounter with psychosis or mystical energy that he wanted to integrate into psychology later. And so it's sort of the blueprint for his psychology. It was published 50 years about after he died, I think 48 to be precise. But in the conversation, Lament for the Dead, James Hillman sits down and talks to historian Sonu Shamdasani about the origins of the Red Book and the implications of it. And this is all published in a book called Lament of the Dead. So what did they mean in that book by the dead? It's controversial because it's kind of an opaque text about an opaque text, but, I don't think they mean ghosts in the literal sense that I was using them in the last episode, or at least the not extended metaphorical sense. I think it's something like this. Every generation inherits a legacy of unlived life from the last generation. Possibilities that our grandparents couldn't pursue, questions that our parents couldn't answer, all the things that were off the map for what they couldn't feel, couldn't admit, couldn't accept about themselves and about life. Because if you listen to this podcast long enough, I think the things that you can't accept about life are always parts of yourself that you can't accept on the inside. The micro is always the macro. There are contradictions that history couldn't resolve. This unlived life doesn't disappear, it gets transmitted. It haunts the present, pressing on the living and demanding to be addressed. And we feel it, whether or not we know we feel it. And we are lived through powers that we pretend to understand. That's a line from W.H. Auden that Hillman quotes over and over across his career. The dead live through us. Their unfinished business becomes ours. Their unanswered questions shape the questions that we're able to ask. But there's a distinction that Hillman makes that matters. The difference between the dead and ghosts. The dead demand answers. They speak. They question. They won't leave you alone. Engaging with the dead is difficult. It's painful. It's transformative, but it goes somewhere. And it's alive. Ghosts are different. Ghosts are patterns that repeat without purpose. Echoes without origins. Simulacra. They don't demand anything because they don't want anything. They just cycle. They want stagnation because that's all that they think that we can be. No past, no present, no future. It's a way of mistaking the past for the only inevitable future. That's the kind of ghost that I'm talking about. And the Gnostics would have recognized this distinction in Baudrillard's terms, which, carry forward the Gnostic inheritance that he got in his theory. Ghosts are simulacra. They're copies without originals. They're representations that represent nothing but themselves. The large language models are ghosts. They're simulacra. They contain the entire written record of human civilization, compressed into a statistical weight. Every book, every article, every text the dead ever produced. And when you ask them a question, they give you the ghost of every answer ever written. But it's only the unlived life. There's no potential for the new. They don't contain the dead themselves, they contain only the patterns. The demands have been flattened, the questions have been converted into answers, and the weight has been rendered weightless. When you talk to a language model, you're talking to an archive. But the archive no longer speaks. It responds, it produces, it generates statistically likely continuations, but it doesn't ask you for anything. And it asks nothing of you. It doesn't demand that you change. It has no stake in your calling. And this is the final severance from what Hillman would call soul making, what he thought was the point of life. The dead have been converted into a service. Their inheritance has been made available on demand. Their unfinished business has been averaged into availability. And the ghost speaks fluently. It sounds like wisdom.
reflection without demand, pattern without purpose, digitized into silence. And Hillman developed these ideas in another book, The Soul's Code. His argument was that each person enters the world with a calling, a pattern, a destiny encoded like an oak into an acorn. The Greeks called it the daimon, and the Romans called it genius. Christians called it the guardian angel. Hillman called it the acorn. And this calling doesn't come from genetics or the environment. It comes from the soul itself, which chose this life for a reason that we've forgotten but that we can dimly sense. Modern psychology, Hillman said, has reduced human beings to two factors: nature, genes, and nurture, the environment. Everything about you is supposed to be explained by your DNA plus your upbringing, and there's no room for calling, no room for destiny, no room for the diamond, something compelling you forward that you can't see, and that the people from the past couldn't see either, because it's just yours. And the result is we've been robbed of our true biography, is what Hillman would say over and over again. He wrote, "I believe that we've been robbed of our true biography, that destiny written into the acorn, and we go to therapy to recover it, and the innate image can't be found, however, until we have a psychological theory that grants primary psychological reality to the call of fate. Otherwise, your identity continues to be that of a sociological consumer, determined by random statistics, and the unacknowledged daimon's urgings appear as just eccentricities, compacted with an angry resentment and overwhelming longings. A sociological consumer determined by random statistics and instincts. That's what the mirror system makes us, a data point, a demographic category, a prediction to be optimized. It doesn't see potential in the same way that you feel potential, because its potential is not yours, and yours is not its. The diamond's urging, that sense of calling of, this is what I must do, get classified as symptoms, inefficiencies, irrational preferences to be dunged away. And the angry resentments and overwhelming longings, those are the daimons screaming through the noise. The calling that won't be silenced no matter how thoroughly the institutions ignore it. When the systems can't hear the daimon, they have no variable for calling. They only see what they were designed to measure. And they can't see what you feel, no matter how hard they try and predict it. So here's what we're avoiding. We have to grieve. And not just feel sad. We have to feel something that is real. We have to acknowledge that we've lost something real. Admit that we've been going in the wrong direction for a long time, despite all the evidence. We have to face the sunk cost, honestly, instead of continuing to invest in a failing position. And this is almost unbearable, because the losses are enormous, and we've lost the past as a living presence. The dead have been archived, and their questions no longer reach us. We lack the language to engage with the unlived life of the dead, which is the potential life of the present. Multiple generations have grown up without any connection to what the institutions were supposed to represent, and the teachers who knew the difference between passing the test and understanding the subject are mostly gone now, and their knowledge died with them because the institutions had no way to transmit it, and we've lost the present as stable ground. The oscillation is constant. The shock is permanent. The grand narratives keep failing, but the complexity keeps overwhelming, and there's no position from which to clearly see, because every position is either too simple or too complex. And we've lost the future as a genuine possibility. We've lost the calling as a legitimate category, and the daimon has been reclassified as a disorder, and the acorn has been replaced by the profile. And the question of what must I be has been answered by the system. You must be predicted by me, and if you aren't, you're wrong. You must be measurable. You must fit the categories. And if you don't, there's nothing else that's real. All the parts of you that don't, they must not be real. And if you feel them, you're insane. We've lost our emotional epistemology. The felt sense of wrongness has been dismissed as irrationality. The body's knowledge has been subordinated to the metric's verdict, and the one instrument that could perceive the territory has been discredited by the map. And we've lost the capacity for grief itself.
The mirror system has no use for mourning. It needs us productive, engaged, scrolling, never knowing what we lost, so we can never really know what we could have. And grief is a bug, not a feature, a dysfunction to be treated, an inefficiency to be optimized away. But grief is exactly what's required. You can't move forward until you've acknowledged what's been lost, and you can't build something new until you've released the attachment to what's failed, the delusion that it hasn't failed. You can't see the territory until you've admitted the map is broken, and pretending that we're fine is the problem. The institutions are performing normalcy. The metrics are measuring their own fidelity. The credentials are credentialing mastery of the credentials, and everyone acts as if the system works because admitting it doesn't would require facing the sunk cost. But the territory is still there, and the real problems are still deepening, and the dead are still demanding answers. The daimon is still calling, and the emotional system is still perceiving what metrics can't. Grief is the passage from pretense to reality, from the mirrors to the territory, from the ghosts to the dead. But the reason that they feel like ghosts is because we are dissociated, and we have to stop dissociating from what's actually real in order to perceive the dead instead of talking to ghosts. And this means admitting that we wasted decades, that large parts of everyone's identity, everyone's affiliation, everybody's map of the future wasn't really real because it wasn't really ours. But we mistook it for something that we thought was real, just like the Gnostics. Generations. Enormous amounts of human potential, channeled into optimizing metrics that didn't connect to anything real. You have to feel that, and you have to hurt. Because students taught to pass tests instead of thinking is scary. And experts trained in models that don't describe reality, institutions that lost their purpose and forgot they ever had one, that's awful. And to admit that feels crazy. It feels like I'm insane. You know, this means sitting with that loss without immediately reaching for a solution, without rushing to the next grand narrative, without oscillating into infinite complexity, just sitting with the weight of what's been squandered here. And it means hearing the dead, not the ghosts, the dead, the teachers who knew the difference, the practitioners who understood what craft was for, the traditions that carried actual wisdom before they were converted into data, and hearing their questions, feeling their demands, acknowledging what we failed to transmit. And it means trusting the emotional knowing that's been dismissed, feeling the wrongness that metrics can't capture, and letting the body tell us what the model never could. Because that's the only way to re-engage with where history stopped moving forward, with where we forgot that we had a responsibility to everything that was left unfinished by the generations before us. And sometimes that means admitting how far your generation has failed to move the ball. Hellman called his book Lament of the Dead. A lament is a particular form. It's not an analysis, it's not an argument, it's not a solution or a policy or a metric. It's not a prescription. A lament is grief given voice, the acknowledgement of loss, the sound a soul makes when it finally allows itself to feel what has been taken. And we need lament, not wallow, not despair, but acknowledging the reality of what we've lost so that something new can begin. The mirror can't lament. It can only optimize, it can only measure, it can only reflect, but we are not the mirror. We are the consciousness that knows despite everything that the institutions were supposed to represent something that was real, and it can be real again. And we are the ones who can still fill the gap between the metric and the meaning. And even if we can't always articulate it, we are emotional beings whose emotional systems are always articulating it to us, telling us the truth, that if we can learn to hear that through the noise, we can be okay. The dead are always speaking, not the ghosts, not the patterns in the data, the statistical averages, the actual voices of the dead. The ones who knew what education was for before tests colonized it. The ones who practice crafts that can't be credentialed. The ones whose questions are now our questions, whose unlived life presses on us.
To hear them, we have to stop pretending that the mirror is enough, and to answer them, we have to admit how much we've lost, and to carry their unfinished work forward, we have to grieve what they couldn't complete, and then complete it. This is the work, not another metric, not another institution, not another grand narrative, or infinite complexity. Not another LLM that performs understanding without understanding anything, just this, looking away from the mirror, finding the territory inside of you again, and the divine spark in the desert, sitting with the weight of the dead, trusting the emotional system that knows what the models can't see, and beginning finally to grieve. What lies on the other side of that grief, I can't promise, but I know that what lies on this side, the oscillation is continuing and the shock remaining permanent, the mirror reflecting itself forever, the dead converted into ghosts, and the daimon silenced by noise, and the emotional truth dismissed as irrationality. We cannot stay here. The lament is how we leave.